Hey everyone, Alexander here for 30 Days of Symphony. Well, the moment has come where we're now rounding the clubhouse turn, to use an old-fashioned phrase, with our survey of the 9 symphonies of Antonin Dvorak. And just as we started the cycle in earnest with his Symphony Number 3, the gorgeously melodic but utterly wayward symphonies numbers 1 and 2 being best left to the connoisseurs, we now are going into this final triptych, this final holy trinity of symphonic masterpieces, the symphonies numbers 7, 8, and 9, which from the moment of their inception have been celebrated round the world as the kind of consummate Dvorak symphonies that they are. As with the 9 symphonies of Beethoven, every Dvorak symphony is unique in its both in its expression, in its content, as well as its structure, its form. And with the Symphony Number 8, you will see down the road that Dvorak gives us the Czech nationalist symphony par excellence. In the 1890s, during his ever celebrated, and rightly so, sojourn in the United States of America, he gives us in this symphony he calls From the New World. He goes back to the beginning. You remember with the Symphony Number 3, an important music critic once described that symphony as a series of symphonic poems rather than movements. With the New World Symphony, the Symphony Number 9, Dvorak gives us here again a quartet of symphonic poems, of musical portraits of the New World. But in the Symphony Number 7, he gives us a cosmopolitan, kind of international style symphony that I think he knew it when he had completed it, when he had put the final double bar on the last page of the manuscript score. I think Dvorak realized that with his 7th symphony, he was giving the world a symphony that could stand alongside the great symphonies of his friend and colleague Johannes Brahms in every way. In fact, during the difficult labors over the composition of the symphony, there were an unusual amount of sketches for the 7th Symphony. He wrote to a friend, I'm having trouble with a certain passage and the movement, but I can't let Brahms down. By this point, Dvorak had allowed Brahms to join Beethoven and Wagner and Liszt as a vital part of this vital circle of influences that Dvorak allowed to kind of cast their kind of shadow over his work. But I say that only in the best sense. Dvorak, early in his symphonies, you hear everywhere the kind of the tragic sense of importance that you get with Beethoven's symphonies, the lyricism, again, perhaps a little unrestrained, of, say, Franz Schubert. And then you get the big influences. In the early symphonies that we talked about, like the Symphony Number 3, the influence of Richard Wagner and his endless melodies of his music dramas is there. In the Symphony Number 4, the influence of Franz Liszt and his so-called New German School. Liszt's passionate intensity, the likes of which had never been experienced before in Western art music. He takes that spirit on as well. And then, I've talked about how it's important to see Dvorak symphonies in pairs. With the 3rd and 4th symphonies were written basically at the same time, and they brought him his first big break. He gets that stipend from the Imperial Education Ministry in Vienna, and it allows him to really, get going in his career. In the 5th and 6th symphonies, Dvorak incorporates another profoundly important influence to his musical psyche, his musical character, and that is this very pastoral sense of Czech nationalism. You remember how the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, written in the middle and later part of the 1870s, are also very much like Symphonies 3 and 4. Symphonies 5 and 6 are very much pendants to each other. They're like really, think of them as, in both cases, think of the two symphonies as the two different sides of one coin. In the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, you have that very easygoing kind of pastoral style. Both symphonies, when you hear them, you can imagine Dvorak and his, smoking his pipe and his good suit, having an enjoyable, amble, an enjoyable walk in the countryside. But now, with the Seventh Symphony, he has earned the attention and respect of the entire European musical scene. He, again, another signal. I've talked about how composers make their signals with key signatures. That Third Symphony of Dvorak, in E flat, the same key signature as Beethoven's Third. His Fifth Symphony, his very pastoral Fifth Symphony, in the key of F major, the same key signature as Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. The Symphony number 6 in D major, which is the same key as the Second Symphony of, again, his friend and colleague Johannes Brahms, which is the final great, profound influence on Dvorak's musical thinking as a symphonist, as a composer of symphonies. And he goes out of his way to consciously model both the first and the last movements of the Sixth Symphony on the D major symphony, the Second Symphony of Brahms, both in their form and content. And remember, the Fifth Symphony is dedicated very successfully to the great German conductor in Berlin and Weimar, Hans von Bülow. And then the Sixth Symphony, with a little less success, it must be said, is dedicated to the conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic, Hans Richter, where, again, coming just after the political crisis in the Habsburg Empire in 1879, in which the imperial government in Vienna finally threw in the towel, as it were, and allowed all the constituent realms of the Habsburg Empire, which by now is called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with two capitals now, not just Vienna, but Vienna and Budapest. The imperial government in Vienna allowed every constituent realm of the empire to do their governmental business in their own vernacular language. And as I was saying, in Vienna, they had this suspicion deep down that the days, they knew not when, but the days were ultimately numbered for this incredible multicultural concept called the Habsburg Empire. And in Vienna, there's now some resentment against the Czechs because they're seen as upstarts who don't want to play ball in the Habsburg system. And so Dvorak is suddenly not welcomed quite as much. So with that sense of rock-hard determination that Dvorak had from the time he was a boy, from the time he was a butcher's son in a little village somewhere off in Bohemia, and he was going to go to Prague and become one of the great composers of all time. And he did it despite so many hardships stacked against him. He did it with that incredible, not only his talent, his genius, but his work ethic and his determination. Now in 1884, 85, he is going to write a symphony where he can truly go mano a mano with Johannes Brahms. And boy, does he ever do that. Here, this symphony, of course, the reception of Symphony number 6 in Vienna had been a rocky road, but much as the German Jewish composer Felix Mendelssohn had been so warmly embraced in Great Britain, so, and 2 generations before that, George Frederick Handel, of course, the great German composer who becomes the ultimate English composer, as they say, the greatest German to write Italian operas in England. But in this great welcoming tradition that the British have always had, most of their history, Dvorak is warmly, rapturously welcomed by the British because he's written some really phenomenal large-scale choral works. Now remember, in the 19th century, in Victorian England, one of the great passions of the Victorians was choral societies. Every town and city had several choral societies, oratorio societies, as they called them, where they would commission and perform these vast choral works scored for choir and vocal soloists and large orchestra. And the British had fallen in love with several of Dvorak's large-scale choral frescoes, most recently his very tragic Stabat Mater, which his setting of the Latin Stabat Mater text that we hear often in Holy Week. Again, speaking of hardships, Dvorak wrote the Stabat Mater on the death shortly after the death of no fewer than 3 of his children. 3 of his children had died in short succession, and he wrote this Stabat Mater, and it was performed in London in the late 1870s, and it was a triumph. So in 1880, he has the greatest honor a Czech musician could receive in London. He is made an honorary member of the London Philharmonic Society. Now remember, amongst the honorary members of the London Philharmonic Society by that point were people like Beethoven. Like Beethoven was an honorary member of the London Philharmonic Society. So this is a big, big deal to Dvorak. Again, for the village kid from some little town in Bohemia, not so bad. He's made a member of the London Philharmonic Society. So he is then commissioned by the society to write a great new symphony. He writes this symphony in a way that he leaves us his most, of all his 9 symphonies, even, notwithstanding the greatness of the 8th Symphony, the G Major Symphony, and the New World Symphony. In the 7th Symphony, he gives us his most sober, concise, most brilliantly, effectively organized symphony. He gives us the one symphony in his output that betrays no Slavonic influences. It is Antonin Dvorak showing the British Germanic musical world, the Anglo-Saxon, Teutonic musical world, that he can write a Brahms symphony just as great as Brahms. And I don't mean to say that in the manner that it sounds like Brahms or he's copying or plagiarizing Brahms. Not at all. But he has taken on, along with the influences of Beethoven and Schubert and Wagner and Liszt and the whole Czech national folk music thing, what he takes from Brahms is Brahms's supreme gift, Brahms's supreme genius at musical organization, at organizing a composer's thematic material. He takes that from Brahms and he imbibes it. It becomes part of him in this Symphony Number 7. There, of course, are hints of it in Symphony Number 6, where he models that work on the Brahms D major symphony, as I said. But with the Symphony Number 7, he chooses the most somber of key signatures, my friends, D minor. Now remember, D minor is the key of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. D minor is the key of, again, he's signaling to his audience, D minor is the key of the Brahms First Piano Concerto. So he's making a statement even in the choice of the key, the most somber key signature, the most somber tonality that there is. And the first movement, as Dvorak had demonstrated in the first movement of his 6th Symphony, in the first movement of the 7th Symphony, Dvorak, without quoting Brahms in any way, though, he shows that he has completely internalized Brahms's genius, his method of presenting one theme at the very beginning, a very compact theme that's kind of like a little group of melodic cells that is not only beautiful and arresting and grabs your attention, but is also this fertile material for kind of a non-stop thematic development that will take up the entire sonata allegro form of the first movement. Remember, Brahms takes that on. That remember the thing about Brahms with his, as Arnold Schoenberg later commented, the developing variation technique of Brahms. Dvorak now takes that on and makes that language his own. So he does this, though, in a way that is completely, his own music. It's this very somber, hushed, whispered opening that you just already know is going to be the calm before the storm. And then the music explodes in this D minor diminished chord. And the second theme, as only Dvorak could do, is gorgeously lyrical. It's kind of a relief. But then we go back to the D minor key. We have this churning but brilliantly organized, so dense and compactly organized symphonic development section. And then, building on the tradition established by Beethoven, he makes the coda. Remember what a coda is? It's the Italian word for tail. It's the tag at the end of the sonata form. He makes the coda, as Beethoven would do, kind of a second development section. But here he builds this up to a relentless climax that even the most bigoted anti-Bohemian German musician could not have not been totally impressed by. The second movement, another gorgeous, lyrical, serene, Dvorak slow movement, the kind of slow movement that I think audiences had by now come to expect in his symphonies. It is a work, the second movement, excuse me, it is a piece of musical serenity and calm, but there is none whatsoever of that kind of carefree, easygoing, pastoral quality that you experienced in the slow movements of symphonies number 5 and 6. Again, there's not that kind of afternoon walk in the Bohemian forests. There's none of that. This is somber yet serene, and it has long been admired as along with the slow movement of the New World Symphony, with the famous, tune for the English horn that became an African-American spiritual, Going Home, along with the slow movement of the New World Symphony. This is seen as indisputably his greatest slow movement. So again, it's very, very compact. It's kind of a combination of like a 3-part form and a sonata. He develops his material, but it kind of comes back, and it's very straightforward and compact and absolutely just profoundly serene music from Antonin Dvorak. The scherzo, I kind of lied when I said that there were no Slavonic influences in this piece. The scherzo is the one movement, the only moment in this Symphony number 7 in which you get a hint of that Slavonic dance feeling. By now, Dvorak's first set of Slavonic dances, along with, like Edvard Grieg's lyric pieces and Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, were a copy of the piano version was sitting in every piano bench in Europe and much of America. And you get a hint of that, just a hint of it in the rhythm, not the melodic content. Again, it's this very Germanic, kind of Brahmsian thing, but there is that very Slavonic, that sense of what we call hemiola, which is a musical rhythmic term for 2 against 3. 2, like a duple rhythm going on within a triple, like da 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 da. They're very, very distinctive and very difficult for an orchestra to bring off, actually. It's very delicate and exposed. The finale, like the preceding 3 movements of this symphony, is utterly, is just compact in its form and its expression. There is none of that discursiveness that you got. Remember, like the finale of the Symphony number 5, where Dvorak turns this symphonic finale into kind of like a de facto symphonic poem, and there are all these kind of musical detours, and you're you're going for your walk again in that beautiful garden and Bohemia, but none of that here. It's all business. And there's this, again, in the home key of D minor, there's this truly not grandiose, not pompous, but a true sense of heroic tragedy. And you sense that Dvorak in this music is communicating to the listener an inner conflict in himself. And it is widely acknowledged that in the early to mid 1880s, Dvorak felt deeply conflicted about, was he going to be this Czech nationalist firebrand of a composer, like his older colleague Bedřich Smetana, the conductor and composer, the conductor who had conducted some of the premieres of his most important early works, who left the world that magnificent cycle of 6 symphonic poems called Ma Vlast, My Country, which is played every year at the legendary Prague Spring Festival. Was he going to be a composer like Smetana, again, this firebrand nationalist? Or was he going to be like Tchaikovsky and be the Slavophile who becomes basically a German composer? Was he going to be a nationalist, or was he going to be a cosmopolitan? Well, in the 7th symphony, again, there is the nod to his Slavonic tradition in the third movement, but otherwise he is out to be this self-made, utterly self-made Czech artist who's going to prove to the world, and by world I really mean the German-speaking lands of Central Europe, that, again, he can go head-to-head with the best of theirs any day. So again, you get this somber mood, this heroic sense of struggle, but the musical ideas could not be, even by the standards of Johannes Brahms, they could not be more tightly organized. Only at the very end do we have a turn to the key, the sunlight of D major, and we get this joyous resolution at the very end. This was one of the works one of the symphonies that actually was published in Dvorak's lifetime. Fritz Zimrock, his German publisher in Berlin, who had made off Dvorak a lot of money with that first book of Slavonic dances and the Moravian duets and all these piano pieces. Zimrock, it's fair to say, looked down his nose at Dvorak. He never bothered to publish Dvorak's 2nd, 3rd, or 4th symphonies, but he published the 6th symphony as the 1st symphony, published the 5th symphony as the 3rd symphony, and then published this 7th symphony as the symphony number 2, which makes no sense whatsoever, but that's what Zimrock demanded, and that's what he got. He also paid Dvorak a pittance of a fee for the rights to publish this work. His view as a Berliner towards Dvorak as a Czech artist was so condescending that he wanted to change Dvorak's first name on the title page from Antonin to Anton. In other words, from a Czech first name to a German first name. And Dvorak, that was when Dvorak said, enough is enough, I'll take your lousy fee, but you're not going to change my name. So they had to compromise. So if you look at the first edition of the score published by Zimrock in Berlin, it simply says Ant Dvorak, A-N-T period Dvorak. So this was the state. I mean, Dvorak, a man who had everything running against him, politically, financially, ethnically, personally, and yet he rose above all of that through his genius, his work ethic, and his determination to be one of the great composers of his time. And with the premiere of this Symphony Number 7, or as it was then called, Symphony Number 2, but not that he wanted that, but with the premiere of this D minor symphony in London, Dvorak's reputation was cemented for all time. The premiere in London was rapturous. Not just the end of the symphony, but at the end of each of the 4 movements, there was wild applause. The premiere, conducted by Hans Richter in Vienna, surprise, surprise, was a bit lukewarm. Von Bülow conducts the symphony, however, in Berlin, which was at that time had already emerged as a more progressive musical center. The premiere in Berlin is also a total success. And then it is the third of the great triptych, this amazing group of just genius Germanic conductors, who is the youngest of them, who's now emerging. Remember, von Bülow is in Berlin, Hans Richter is with the Vienna Philharmonic, and now from Budapest, the German-Hungarian conductor, Artur Nikisch. It is Nikisch who will then take the Seventh Symphony to the United States. And that is a story. Dvorak in America, of course, is its own story yet to come. But for now, please enjoy and savor the sublime Symphony in D minor, the Symphony number 7 of Antonin Dvorak, in this supremely accomplished performance with the greatest Czech conductor of the 20th century, Raphael Kubelik, conducting the Bavarian Radio Orchestra in Munich.